So, so what is sensitive research? Research may be defined as sensitive if the data is private, stressful, or discussion needs to generate an emotional response. Research ethics committees are heavily focused on the impact of the research participant, but they do not acknowledge how sensitive material can psychologically be disturbing for researchers. University ethics applications and protocols draw primarily from biomedical research and prioritise physical over mental harm, as well as research participants over the researcher. Sensitive research should be inclusive of everybody in the research process, be it participants, interviewers, researchers, and transcribers. The idea of researching the researcher has largely gone uncharted, and this could be due to social stigma surrounding mental health in general. In addition, academia is a field which usually encourages a professional distance to assure objectivity and to avoid bias. However, this can stifle our empathy and constrain our ability to articulate emotional impact of our research. Empathy from researchers to research participants is significant when doing sensitive research. This is considered in how we choose to conduct the interviews and how we choose to analyse them. They usually focus on topics of inequality, injustice, vulnerability, and oppression. Ariana Markowitz argues that we devalue emotional intelligence and coping mechanisms over analytical and technical skills. This could be linked to the historically low prestige assigned to interpretive qualitative research, viewed as subjective and feminine relative to scientific knowledge. Feminist researchers, conscious of feminist epistemologies and personal experiences, engage in research on sensitive topics and acknowledge personal privileges, power dynamics, and emotions. Markowitz states that feminist researchers and anthropologists have largely abandoned the idea that it is possible or even desirable to do objective and unbiased research. So, emotional labour. Whilst feminist research has been at the forefront of opening up discourses around researcher emotions, it is particularly female researchers who are more likely to engage in sensitive and emotionally harmful research. It is important to remember the gendered responsibility of care. Women are traditionally socialised into caregiving roles, and the emotional labour involved in care must also be considered. Doing sensitive and feminist interviewing clearly requires the researcher to be emotionally attuned and sensitive to her emotions and needs of the participants. Emotional labour can involve self-disclosure, acts of reciprocity, caring, engaging, active listening, and showing emotion and empathy and being supportive. So why do sensitive research? Well, ethical questions need to be considered. What will it have? What effect will it have? Is it possible to do harm? Does it do any good? And who has something to gain? Theoretically, does it contribute to knowledge, and what does it contribute? Sensitive research is often carried out for activist and potential policy impact. The In Her Shoes Facebook page gives an insight into women's lived experiences and the reality of illegal abortion. The stories provide us with details of being refused healthcare, barriers to access, the experiences of travel for healthcare abroad, and illegally ordering pills online, and the emotional impact of this. As a resource, it shares women's stories and allows us to learn from them as a society. For this project, I read 622 posts of the In Her Shoes Facebook page. Catalogue terms were added, anonymisation decisions made, and a sensitivity audit was carried out. The stories contain multiple accounts of rape, domestic violence, suicidal attempts, and other forms of abuse. Given the sensitive nature of the research, a researcher protocol was established, and this will be shown later in the presentation. So the impact on the researcher. Elena Sander argues that the researcher is part of their field and therefore should have a personal interest in contributing to political and societal transformation and in deconstructing current systems which fail communities. Many of the people who do dangerous or sensitive research are driven by a sense of moral obligation to contribute to change and to offer solidarity with people who suffer. The mode of communication is important. Sensitive interviews lasting an hour or more can be intense, while one-off interviews can limit onward contact, can also be emotionally difficult for the researcher. On the other hand, too much contact with participants after can also be problematic. For example, if the participant leans on the researcher for emotional support after the interview. Most researchers do not have the capacity or professional expertise to assist them. While it is nice to create a friendly relationship, it is also important to maintain boundaries. As researchers, we may feel a responsibility to try and improve things for our participants, but it is important to know the limit of what we can and can't do for someone. Casewell and Kiefer state that in an interview setting, it is important to recognize the power imbalance between participant and researcher. We must consider the dangers of storytelling and the inequalities of risk regarding differences in power in the process. We must engage differences between self and other. They argue that while we may empathize with others, it is important to acknowledge our differences. Researchers must also acknowledge that we encourage participants to relive difficult experiences and then sometimes abandon them to come to terms with their distress alone. Alana Sander argues that researchers should build on collaborative, reciprocal, trusting, and non-oppressive relations with research participants. She argues that mutual respect between researcher and participant is imperative. In terms of online research, the internet is often viewed as a detached mode of communication. In the case of with the In Her Shoes data, we have access to one post on social media and no follow-up afterward. When analysing social media data, we get an insight into their experiences. For example, we know that they had a very difficult period in their lives, but we might be left wondering what happened. Were they okay in the end? In these circumstances, the researcher may feel like a bystander or a witness rather than an active agent, which can be difficult. In terms of transcription, coding, and research analysis, transcription can be a mechanic or an objective process. The transcription process allows for a reflection of the interview. It can alter your understanding and allow you to pick up things you might have missed in the interview. When I was doing my PhD research, I found transcription quite difficult. Many women encountered abuse in the mother and baby homes, and although they told me this during the interview, there was something about the act of putting it on paper that made it very real for me. Others might find the coding process or analysing the material challenging. During her research on domestic violence, Heather McCosker said, quote, "I found myself dreading the work. I knew that the interviews were powerful and that the survivor stories were important and urgent, but I found it hard to write and I was constantly distracted from the work." End quote. Working on sensitive research may increase the risk of vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout. This is referred to as traumatic contagion. Vicarious trauma may cause decreased motivation and empathy. Longer-term reactions to trauma include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and sometimes physical symptoms like headaches and nausea. Like burnout, secondary traumatic stress is characterized by intrusive imagery, hyperarousal, and avoidance. As a result of chronic exposure to the realities of trauma, it can lead to feelings of grief, rage, outrage, sorrow, desensitization, and loss. Some researchers also use a deliberate strategy of psychological distancing from interview data as a form of self-protection. Others experience emotional overexertion or exhaustion. According to Martinez, strategies for emotional distancing need to be considered and adaptive and adopted if the research topic has a potential to be emotionally challenging. So, as mentioned, a self-care protocol was developed as part of the Archiving Reproductive Health project and includes practicalities for working with sensitive or traumatic data. The self-care protocol is ongoing and is changing over time as it's being implemented. These are some of the things that I found helpful while I was working on the In Her Shoes data. The work is still ongoing, so as I say, the self-care protocol is still being developed. I should have said feel free to take a screenshot or a photograph if you want for your own notes. I'm happy to share that. And when the self-care protocol is finalised, it will be shared on the DRI website, the Digital Repository of Ireland, and you can find it there. And then in terms of vicarious trauma, it's important to know and recognise the signs. Secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue. These include insomnia, difficulty sleeping, headaches, heart palpitations, depression, and others. And some of the physical behavioural signs are listed in the boxes below. And as I said, if you want to take a screenshot of that, please work away. And that's all I have for now. And I think Mandy's going to talk about her experience of implementing a self-care protocol. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, Lorraine. We've been talking about this topic. Now it's kind of the fourth event, but each presentation brings in new aspects and new perspectives. So it was really interesting to hear. Maybe take notes of your questions, and then we'll have time for discussion after the next presentation by Mandy. So Mandy Lee is a PhD candidate in sociology at Trinity College Dublin. She is also an assistant professor at the Centre for Health Policy and Management, School of Medicine. And her PhD research is focused on exploring the trauma and resilience of the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement from the disciplinary perspectives of narrative medicine, resistance studies, and social movement research. She has published and disseminated work on health policy and healthcare management research, and her scholarly interests are on the themes of person and people-centeredness and ethics. And she helped establish the Health Policy and Management and Center for Global Health Research Ethics Committee at Trinity, and is also a co-founding member of the Research and Development Subgroup of the National Health and Social Care Professionals Office of the HSE. So I'm very happy that Mandy is joining us today as well, and you are free to share now your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kadula, and thank you so much, Lorraine, for your lovely presentation earlier on a lot of the frameworks and theory that we can actually think about when doing sensitive or traumatic research. So I think I may just share my screen now. Hold on a second. So sorry, now I think you can see my screen. A moment. So everybody can see my screen? Yes. So thank you so much. As Kadula mentioned, I also have another role in terms of I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Health Policy and Management in the School of Medicine in Trinity. But for this presentation, I'm really speaking from the standpoint as a PhD candidate in sociology, and Lorraine has talked a lot more about the theory and as well as practice of actually conducting sensitive and traumatic research. And I want to speak more about the experience of developing self-care protocol as a way to mitigate some of the risks of actually doing sensitive and traumatic research. And I suppose it actually is helpful to remember why we need a self-care protocol, and Lorraine has spoken to that point already in relation to the fact that it is something that we have to manage. But I think these two quotes from the University of Sheffield Research Ethics Committee is also helpful to be mindful of, because a lot of times the well-being of researchers tend to be placed directly on the researcher themselves. But as you shall see in my discussion later on, really care work has an individual as well as communal and institutional dimension to it. And we shouldn't, when we talk about self-care protocol, even though it is called self-care protocol, we really should be talking a lot more about how we as a community and how we as an institution support researchers as well. And the reason why I want to talk about this self-care protocol in the context of my PhD is because, you know, my PhD requires me to have sustained contact with traumatic or upsetting materials. And it's also the act of immersion in a single project that actually presents a lot of risks to the researcher. And I'm feeling that particularly in the context of my PhD on the trauma and resilience for participants of the Hong Kong democracy movement, because previously I have also done qualitative research. I have collected, for example, patient narratives of their experience, of their lived experience of heart disease. But that material was not traumatic or sensitive to me. Is actually the fact that I'm actually connected to the community of Hong Kongers that actually makes my present PhD investigation emotionally demanding on me. So when we talk about definitions of traumatic or emotionally demanding research, it's not just the topic itself. Again, this definition from the University of Sheffield Research Ethics Committee I thought was very helpful, because they also point to the fact that it could be that the researcher encounters people who have been affected by this issue, or that the researcher themselves have a particular connection to or experience with that particular topic, or that is affecting themselves or close family members. So for me, it's actually the personal connection to the Hong Kong community that is actually causing my research topic to be emotionally demanding on me as a researcher, which is something that I hadn't encountered before, and it is something that I'm still learning to grapple with. And so this is kind of my way of showing what it is like to be immersed in emotionally demanding research, using some quotations and artwork from Hong Kong. So this particular cartoon basically showing a person lying in his bed looking at news on his phone and just crying. That image was shared thousands of times on Hong Kong social media during 2019 when the protest movement was in full swing. And there was lots of upsetting imagery of police brutality being shared online, and this particular cartoon was very popular precisely because it really spoke to the experience of many Hong Kongers. But that was 2019 when we had lots of news about police brutality. But 2021, this past summer, when physical protests had actually quietened down quite a lot, was actually also emotionally demanding to me in another way. And these quotes, this is from July, the 8th of July, just this past summer. For example, Rachel Cheung is a journalist from Hong Kong. She tweeted about the fact that basically there was a taxi driver she was talking to who was watching YouTube videos and basically saying that he wanted to persuade his taxi customers to leave Hong Kong, especially the young ones. The quote is, "There is no hope for this place." And why there was no hope? Because basically, especially since the 1st of July, 2021, actually since last year when the national security law legislation has been put in place, the civil society in Hong Kong is dissolving at a very fast pace. So this is another quote on Twitter that really spoke to me. Hong Kong is lost. Or how a friend said yesterday, it's just dark day after dark day after dark day. So because my PhD project is on the Hong Kong democracy movement, I feel duty bound to actually pay close attention to this bad news after bad news, but I find it difficult to switch off I was immersed in it, and I found it very difficult to step back away from it. So I had all the signs of vicarious trauma that Lorraine talked about in her presentation, which is this negative change in your thoughts, perceptions, and interpretations. And this is something that you need, and the reason why it was a good idea to note the physical signs and symptoms that Lorraine had in her presentation, because I needed to note this myself, because to me, I was saying to myself at the time, this is during this past summer, I was saying to myself, I shouldn't be upset. Why should I be so upset? Because yes, I'm watching news of, let's say, the largest teachers union being dissolved, or the Confederation of Trade Unions in Hong Kong being dissolved, etc., etc. But they were not upsetting imagery. Why was I still upset? And then I have only now came to realize that there is no should or shouldn't about being upset. You are upset. It is important that you recognize when you are upset. What was unhelpful to me was I told myself I shouldn't be upset, but actually I was. And so recognizing signs of vicarious trauma and other signs of being emotionally impacted by your research is important. And so what can we do about this? And there are lots of very helpful resources and guidelines, and the DRI, when Lorraine, you're talking, when your guide will be published, that will be another very helpful resource to researchers. What I have found very helpful, apart from the University of Sheffield Research Ethics Committee guidelines on sensitive research, emotionally demanding research, is also the writings of Ariana Markowitz that has also been mentioned by Lorraine. In particular, there's this particular guide that she had developed, which I thought was a very good template for us to kind of structure our thoughts about emotionally demanding research. And I think that you can also maybe take a screenshot of this slide in terms of just the kind of things that are actually being talked about when we think about developing a self-care protocol. It's the kind of questions that you need to think through, not only when you're actually conducting the research, but also when you're planning the research, as well as conducting the research, and when you're communicating and producing research. So I will actually kind of pause a little bit here just to show you the, can you still see my screen? And thank you. So, because basically this is the actual self-care protocol that I have actually written up just last month, and it's about 6,000 words. And I'll explain why it's 6,000 words rather than just a nice kind of handy guidelines. Is because I take each of these questions that Ariana Markowitz has mentioned, I took them seriously, and I try to apply it to my own research. I mean, I won't actually scroll through all of them, obviously. I will just switch back to the presentation. But what I want to say is that the self-care protocol, it is a work in progress document, obviously, to me, but it's not just because of the fact that I'm only starting my PhD journey now. So I obviously when I'm conducting research, I would say it needs to be continually adapted. But the key thing is that it is a living document, and it is a personal document. It's not just about, just jotting some guidelines and then just leaving it as it is. This is not a tick box exercise for an ethics committee. It's not an assignment that you have to do for your research supervisor, even though this actually did start off as almost an assignment from my supervisor, David Landy, who very kindly asked me to develop this. But it actually is the value comes from it being lived and being applied in your own research. So I won't go through all my answers to these questions, but I would like to kind of highlight a few points. So, for example, this idea of what steps that we can take to prepare for, how do we handle kind of challenging materials and basically creating that kind of physical and emotional distance that Lorraine talked about. So some coping strategies include having appropriate working space, building breaks, limiting the periods of exposure, identifying the fatigue point, creating some distance between yourself and your research, being with family and friends. Now, these all sound kind of commonsensical advice that you will give to anybody. You know, we say, oh, well, this is just obvious, isn't it? I mean, it is obvious, but it isn't so obvious when you're actually in the throes of actually being immersed in the actual trauma itself. And for example, creating some distance between you and your research. Some people do it kind of physically. So like, you know, when Lorraine and I, when we shared our experiences, Lorraine mentioned, for example, that there was one instance when we take ourselves physically away from whether it was the room or the house, just to go outside, you know, just to physically create that break between you and the research material that is traumatic. So that is one way. But for example, this is the reason why I say that it is important to make it applicable to your own circumstance. The actual guideline from the University of Sheffield Research Ethics Committee talked about the fact that researchers are not expected to take traumatic, sensitive, or upsetting research materials into their homes and other personal spaces. Now, that is not possible in my case, you know, because, I'm actually, you know, keeping up with a lot of news from Hong Kong, and I do it a lot on my phone, to be honest, but also obviously on the computer. But and I, especially since COVID times, when a lot of us are working from home, you know, we cannot actually have materials that are actually physically located in an office that we go to 9 to 5. I have materials in my home that is to do with my research that is emotionally traumatic. So when talking to this point, I was very frank in explaining to my supervisor that, well, actually that is not possible. But I then create other types of boundary setting. I created temporal boundary setting for myself. So I only, for example, only look at Hong Kong news between certain hours of the day. I limit my amount of exposure to it. So it is a way of making the rules work for you. And then there's also another kind of tactic in terms of coping with this, such as debriefing. And really, I think this is a helpful, in this case, this is a very helpful guideline, which is debriefing is a conversation. Now, it could be between peers or between you and your supervisor, which is focused on making sense of and normalizing our reactions to upsetting or traumatic experiences. And I have to say that I'm extremely lucky that I have been able to do this with my peer, in this case, Lorraine, because we're in this lovely peer support group, which I will talk about a little bit more, but also with my supervisor as well, that I feel safe enough to actually talk about the fact that, oh, I actually have been upset. I had actually not feel well. It's not about, it's not a conversation only about you making progress on your research, but also you reacting to what's been happening in the field, that you can find somebody to talk to about that. So peer support is extremely important. And I am so grateful for the fact that between Lorraine and myself, we have been able to establish a small peer support group on research dealing with traumatic materials. And this was, you know, this was just something that we floated kind of a few months ago, or just earlier this year when we first kind of got introduced to each other. We had exchanged a few emails, and then I kind of boldly suggested, maybe can we potentially set up a peer support group, because I read about this being helpful, but I don't know who I could find. And Lorraine was one of the first people that was so helpful to me when I was starting off this journey in terms of just sharing materials that she has. And also when we decided to have a trial run of a peer support group meeting, it was the fact that we could, it is a safe space for the two of us to share our experiences, that we didn't feel, in the way, in some, depending on certain situations, you may be in group situations whereby you actually have to kind of manage a front of, oh, I'm making progress, or oh, I'm doing well in this, that, and the other. A peer support group session is where basically you can kind of let that side rest and just be yourself and just explain what has been going on. And so I find that particularly helpful. I mean, I do find peer support from other fellow academics, as well as hopefully, because I'm also with the sociology department, there's a peer support, there's a peer group of fellow PhD students, and we have a WhatsApp group kind of, and in which we can ask silly questions and stupid questions, which is another sign of where you actually have a peer support group, as opposed to a group whereby you just kind of present your achievements, which could be quite, kind of potentially hard on yourself, the way. But what happened in particularly was over the summer, July and August, especially in August, when I was feeling quite isolated, to be honest, because of a lot of the bad news from Hong Kong that just accumulated over time. And I found it hard to debrief. I found it hard to even write in my field diary. So field diary is another strategy that we will talk about later. And I had this meeting scheduled with Lorraine in August. And that, I have to say, that was a lifeline to me in a way, because there's a lot of thoughts in my head that I couldn't quite verbalize, even, to be honest, until when we were in this particular group session. And then I was able to debrief with Lorraine. That was so helpful to me, because there was a lot of pent up. It wasn't that I was treating it as a counseling session, but it was just, how do you deal with that as a researcher and as a person, and being able to voice your fears, voice your concerns, in a collegial atmosphere. That was what was really particularly helpful. So I hope...
Mandy, sorry to interrupt. So there are about 3-4 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So I will be finishing. So don't worry. But so thank you so much for the reminder. So anyway, so I will move on. So basically the idea is that you need to develop overlapping support structures, not only with your academic advisors and your mentors, but also with your peers, friends, also counseling support if you need to access it, involvement in activities that will help you, even if it is just as simple as, for me, going to shop for your groceries, message or calls with friends and families. It's the idea of giving you permission to step away, giving yourself permission to say, okay, I actually can see my friends and family, and it is part of my care work. It is actually looking after yourself is also work. It's this idea of, legitimizing the fact that you can step away, which is what I didn't quite have before. So, so I mentioned other supports being a field diary. So when I first started and I saw field diary being mentioned in some of the guidelines and support structures, I had thought of a field diary almost like a progress tracker. And that wasn't helpful to me, because I wasn't able to write anything, because I wasn't able to make any progress, because I was upset and I was stuck, essentially. So what was really helpful was my conversation with Lorraine, and she was talking about how you can write out the reactions to the news and events. So it may not even just be reflections. I may not even be emotionally mature enough to think about reflecting on these properly, but it's just me reacting to it, and your field diary recording your reactions. So, and that is helpful, So then that kind of lessens the bar of me actually, using the field diary as a proper coping strategy for what you're experiencing in dealing with kind of traumatic research. Also, helpline and counseling services. In Trinity, there's a student counseling service. There's also the postgraduate advisory service. And what I want to say is that this care work has individual, communal, and institutional dimensions. These are words of Ariana Markowitz as well. So, you have permission. It is legitimate to access this help. Don't think that you have to cope with it on your own. I mean, one key message I want to bring out about self-care protocol is not just about yourself. You're not on your own. I want to say, even so, it's almost a self-care protocol. It's almost like a misnomer, because it's not about you being on your own and trying to cope on your own. It's you accessing and developing overlapping support structures. So I will skip this slide now, but I want to end with this particular slide. This is again another artwork from a pair of Hong Kong artists. We're in this together, and we need to, we have a community of researchers around us, but it's about finding people that you can connect to, that you feel safe disclosing your the impact of emotionally demanding work on yourself. And you know, even this kind of seminar series that Julia has kind of has organized has been very helpful, because we can begin to talk to each other about things that we are grappling with, you know, as a group, that you're not on your own dealing with this. So also have some kind of references and resources, including the guidelines from Markowitz and also from the University of Sheffield that I found helpful, as well as other ones. So you can take a snapshot of that. But that is it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, Mandy. If it's fine, I would now actually stop the recording, just so that everyone also feels free to ask their questions. And